I'm going to be 56 in a few weeks, and I managed to live probably the first 30 years of my life without ever hearing the phrase business model. And I'm not sure it did me any harm at all. So, I've worked closely with open source communities for a while, and I've never heard anyone in an open source community use the phrase either. So when I was speaking to Pat and agreeing to come here, part of what I wanted to do was at least look into, if I wanted to visualize where business models were going, at least try and figure out why people use the phrase and what it meant in origin. As I was introduced, I was originally an economist, and my favorite quote, my sense of business in general is that people make shoes, not money. Money is an end result. You choose something that customers want and you do it well, and if you do it well enough, you have the ability to make some money as a result. It's an outcome of human beings settling and agreeing some form of division of labor, being able to exchange value in some form or shape, because everyone didn't have to do everything once you began to form a community. One of the essences of community is you don't have to be the be-all and end-all of everything. You can actually agree terms where people can specialize in some form or shape. So when Peter Drucker made the statement about people making shoes, not money, it's something that mattered to me. Later, people started making sort of more Eastern philosophical statements, or in a hurricane build windmills. And other than the time when I saw wind farms in some parts of this country not do too well during high wind, at least I began to realize that people were talking about something that mattered when they used these kind of phrases. So I went to the traditional place, Wikipedia, and said, okay, what does it actually tell me? And some words began to spring out. Okay? Business models were always in the context of organizations, never customers. And only organizations are capable as entities of using words like capture. Okay, capture, is that really how you want to describe an engagement between people, to say, tie you up, make it hard for you to move, look hungrily as you approach? Is this really, if that was what business models were about, then maybe I'm glad I didn't see the term earlier. But what is clear is that there was a period in life, for a variety of reasons, where an organization said it is possible to create a model by which we are going to make money, and the customer is somewhere in that part of that model, but there were other parts of the model that were more interesting. What changed? Why am I here? Why can I speak optimistically about the future? One of the changes was migration. When human migration became easier, public policy shifts allowing people to move a lot more than they could move earlier, it was one of the first series of lock-ins that started being challenged. And the second tool, besides public policy shifts that allowed human financial and other capital to be able to shift around, and the power that came from connectivity, when you put those two together, suddenly some of the traditional lock-in approaches of the past became a bit harder. And I think that we were used, and it's not my thoughts alone, you guys are used to hearing a lot of people talk about it. Lock-in type models are fundamentally based around creating scarcity. Okay? You want to create a business model where something has a premium because you do things like capture value and make it hard for that value to move around. The fundamental basis of most business models up to now have been that of creating scarcity, whether using or leveraging existing scarcity or building walls in order to create that scarcity if it didn't exist beforehand. And you start going into silos and butter mountains before you know what you're doing. You start going into hoarding and cornering markets before you know what you're doing, because fundamentally, the way you set about business is to say, my whole reason for existence is to be able to focus on making something scarce, because then my customer won't run away. More importantly, my customer can't run away. right? I have captured that customer, bound and torn. Those sort of thoughts and models permeate the way we've thought about business. There is a different way, and that different way is, in a William Gibsonish form, not something that is generations into the future, but that is happening now. And we have to start looking at how that new form works, right? It is, I love this little cartoon because, that is the essence of where we are trying to go as far as I'm concerned, in terms of an abundance model, but an abundance model not just stated as things were scarce, things can become abundant, let's live in an abundant society, let's try and understand abundance economics, but what that actually means in the context of future business models. Right? Abundance is not about stocks, it's not about dams, it's about flows. And it's about flows that go beyond dams in the traditional form. It's making flows of every type of value creator possible in ways that you have to start really thinking that even the term capture value starts getting challenged. Because these are not places where you can capture value in the traditional form, because you have to slow things down, you have to snapshot them, you have to freeze them, you have to lock them in order to even have to deal with concepts like capture. But that doesn't mean that all business is dead, because sometimes even when a balloon is going to be released, there is work to be done in making sure you can collect the balloons in order to release them. There are enabling infrastructures that are possible. And there is money to be made instead of creating lock-in in enabling freedom. And the enabling freedom models I wanted to sort of take you through are actually those that people are creating now, and organizations start becoming intermediaries rather than the owners of the lock-in. You go from an owner of something that is locked to an enabler of something that is freed. Okay? One of my favorites is Mealcoo, and it's still evolving, it's still pivoting. Right? Mealcoo began by saying, why don't you rent out the space at your dining table? Okay? So it was the beginnings of saying, if human beings are connected and free to be able to understand what they have inventory of and free to be able to trade that inventory, because you can standardize the inventory and share it in ways that it is discoverable, searchable, it is transactable, it's tradable, then the first thing that people started doing was things like Mealcoo, which was to say, I have a spare seat at my table. It's as easy to cook for 6 as to cook for 4. Let me do it this way. Or cook for 2 as to cook for 1. But more importantly, over time, they turned around and said, I'm going to get rid of that spare capacity in different ways. You don't actually have to come and sit at my table to eat it. I'll get it shipped to you. I'll find a way of getting it to you. But again, it was a relatively local economy. The shipping wasn't taking place over 5,000 miles. Mealcoo-type structures were the beginnings of saying, you can establish a knowledge of inventory that you have as an individual, as a customer, and be able to share that. The business model started shifting from the institution to the individual, and individuals became both buyer and seller. An exchange-type model evolved, and the institution became an enabler, a platform, a place where these things could happen and get sort of exposed in ways that made sense. Again, I really enjoy the ethos of something like FlightCar. I travel a lot, so even though I've never learned to drive, I see people saying a car comes to an airport, it goes into a garage, they get onto a plane, they get out the other side, and they rent a car. The same asset that they left behind in a car park the other side. If people could match those inventories in some form, because people were going to be doing this on both sides, hundreds, thousands of people flying in different directions, leaving their cars in car parks, if you could find a way of A, standardizing it, B, sharing it so that it's exposed, making it discoverable, then we could start changing some of the model, because inventory is no longer the stock, the lock, the scarcity model. This is a flow model. This is an abundance model, because everyone who ever goes through an airport who parks a car over there is capable of participating in this economy. It goes beyond the idea of things you own, right? Your skills become part of it. So when you see something like the if this then that community, people build something and say, I create a set of conditional statements to allow you to link different services together, different devices together, And you can find it easily, you can reuse it. So the idea of taking your skill and making it shareable became the second order of how customers were changing any form of business. Because the model over here is not that someone's going to own this, patent it, and start charging a rent for it by making it scarce, but that you free it up and value is created by those who are capable of enabling it, because the creation of it has become much, much cheaper. You're creating an abundance of it, because once I've created it for my own use, it's like the Grateful Dead attitude to music, I've played it, now let the audience do with it what they want. Right? They created, to me, the Grateful Dead were one of the greatest economists I've ever seen. Jerry Garcia, live on. Right? Then you move on to the impact of what happens when manufacturing starts entering the home. And the same kind of principles start evolving, because people are building platforms that attract those who want to contribute, whether it's their asset, their time, their skill. And when those come along, the reach that these platforms can have is to everybody else that is connected. The intermediaries only exist as enablers to be able to make that exchange possible. And there are tools you have to be able to play within that, which I will come to in a minute. Most of you have probably heard of Fold It again. The skills are not necessarily trivial. Problem solving happens on a very large scale. Game theory starts being brought in. Competitive techniques can get brought in. You're solving problems that the world would not have traditionally been able to solve using traditional methods. Einstein has repeatedly been quoted as saying, you cannot use the tools of a current paradigm to solve the problems of the next paradigm. We need community-based tools. The business models that are emerging are customer-based and abundance-based rather than organization-based and scarcity-based. The concept of the organization has had to shift as a result. Right? Markets form, and every market that forms that has reduced barriers to entry that allow people to be able to enter, to connect with others, to share, to standardize, to collect back. Right? The market is just an enabling factor. It's not a controlling factor. It's not a locking or capturing factor. Right? We share, apparently, with no worry about what it means, our social networks with people. But again, these sharings cannot take place unless exchanges have value. Right? And the value proposition that comes when people start sharing their social logins is fundamentally saying, if I knew where my friends were, what music they were listening to, what books they'd read, what comments they had, what reviews they had, that is much more meaningful than the prior forms of sharing where you had to rely, when the cost of finding out what your friends thought of something was very high, you relied on celebrity endorsement as a proxy. Now you can actually find out what your friends think of. That's a far more valuable recommendation endorsement route. One of my favorites for how models change on their heads and people even volunteer time is what happened after the earthquake and the tsunami in Japan, where literally hundreds of thousands of people around the world gave their time voluntarily in order to help the memories of those people who had lost lots of things, including lives, in the tragedy. And they worked on using their skills to Photoshop water-damaged photographs. Okay? Now, that may have meant nothing to most people, but meant a lot to the people, the survivors, who had lost pretty much everything else they had. The problem with these sort of environments where we build exchanges and allow millions of people to participate is that you create logjam. And as Clay Shirky has repeatedly said, there is no such thing as information overload, there is only filter failure. So there are many ways for businesses to get better at enabling customers to interact with each other in an abundance mode rather than in a scarcity mode. You need to learn how to share safely. When I was growing up in India, this was considered perfectly safe. It was the way lots of people travel. But there are ways to be able to improve that, and that's one place where organizations can help, because the intermediary can have value. P2P needs enabling, needs support. Right? People don't understand that even things like cycle schemes aren't about better cycles. It's about the freedom that the generation, I have 3 children, 27, 21, 15, and they would prefer the simplicity and convenience of not having to worry where they park their bike, not having to worry about having to lock their bike. Right? This is not a pure ownership play. It's also a simplicity and convenience play because there is enough to complicate life. So, when you even look at something like iTunes, you have to realize that it's about simplicity and convenience. Now, sometimes when you have a lot of material coming through from people you don't know in places you don't know, curation is valuable, right? The ability to say that something that you actually see is real requires something, even in a peer-to-peer environment, whether you want to use crowdsourced ways of saying that picture is not what it seems, you need to start, the crowdsourcing can only happen when somebody enables it. Right? I spoke about if this, then that. Again, the idea of filtering is bringing conditional actions into a world where these exchanges come through. Right? Businesses have been in the business of talking to us ever since they've understood what hierarchies meant, what broadcast meant. In the modern world, when you move from scarcity to abundance, when it's customer-based, when you don't have capture of value by the business, but capture of value by the customer, then listening becomes important. And not just listening, but listening at scale, because trust has been weakened between most individuals and most large environments. And that trust can only be recreated when you start seeing transparency in how people come onto a network, how people leave a network, what they bring to the network, what they take from the network, ease at which you can move from one network to another, the tools to be able to simplify search, discovery, transactions, the tools to be able to share ratings, recommendations. Right? All these things are meaningful because business can be had. There is a reason for business to exist. People do like people buy from each other, people sell from each other, and have been doing it before we even had the term business. But at the end of the day, none of this is meaningful unless we remember that you have to have a heart for the customer if you expect the customer to have a heart for you. That's all I really wanted to say at this stage. Thank you for your time. Any questions? I've got about 2 minutes for questions.
So does anybody have any questions for JP? Come on.
It's all right. In the afternoon.
I've got some. I'll start, because they're a bit shy. I've been dealing with them earlier, and they're a little bit quiet. I think they're dumbfounded by the future. Clayton Shirky talks a lot about the cognitive surplus.
Yes.
This is an extension of that? And
making the cognitive surplus findable, shareable, tradable becomes the job of modern organizations, rather than trying to capture that surplus and making it hard for that surplus to flow, right? We have to move away from the stocks model, from the capture model, from the static and scarcity model to an abundance model.
And the other thing that struck me is that I mentioned it in my talk earlier that there isn't a record industry mogul anywhere in the world right now who doesn't want to wake up tomorrow morning and find out the internet had just kind of been a bad dream. These new peer-to-peer sharing models, they're going to challenge a lot of traditional models. Do you think it's inevitable that these old hierarchical models will be swept away because of the wave, or do they have to find their place?
Well, I don't actually think that these hierarchical models are old. I actually think they're relatively new, that they are the construct of an aberration in our sort of social development, only about the last 150 years. Music was a performance art. Theater was a performance art. Writing itself was a performance art. This ability to can something and replicate it while you're not there and have that IP traded through generation of organization is very new, right? And organizations and artists who've understood that all art is performance in that sense have already solved that problem. I go back to the Grateful Dead. If your record company executives watch the Grateful Dead, they put 4 taping rows in front of every concert. They have their own tab on the Internet Archive because of the amount of music they've set free. They play concerts. They don't, it's like, I'm going to walk off stage now, but just think about one thing. Find the customer for whom region coding on a DVD or CD was introduced.
Okay, can we just keep you for a little bit longer? Because we're waiting for Martin Rees to turn up, you see. And he's just making his way from downstairs.
All right.
So now we warmed up. Now we do have questions. Bring it right. I'm going to start over here. You, sir.
Cool. Hey, thanks. I'm just curious about the business model behind the idea that you're talking about. Because obviously you're talking about going from sort of a scarcity perspective to kind of the sort of free flow of information kind of thing. I mean, I think a good company to kind of talk about would be something like Facebook, for instance. So now, what's the business model and sort of like what's the trade-off? Because obviously their business model is kind of using people's information to kind of, you know, sort of do sort of advertising, marketing, that kind of thing. At what point, I mean, what's the sort of the trade-off of sort of human, I don't know, just our personal information and sort of the business models that you kind of see sustaining this sort of idea of going sort of more free and sort of less sort of scarce?
Okay, you know, first and foremost, I think of Facebook as a modern telco. Okay, all that it is to begin with is saying there is a directory, a place you can look up who else is on a network, different modes of communicating with those people, and a news feed that tells you changes in status across memberships, groups. You know, it's complicated, whatever else. So, in the same way as you thought of telephone companies or telegraph companies as places whose value gets obtained only through network effects, okay? We have to realize that most of the businesses that have come through in the last decade, an Amazon, a Google, a Facebook, an eBay, a Flickr, all these things, if we step back and look, if we as participants turn off the tap, they don't exist, okay? They exist because of value we provide to them and in interacting with each other. And when we interact with each other, we have to be satisfied that that trade-off is meaningful. And I was having some conversations before this in the room. The challenge comes with such institutions about whether that is symmetrical or asymmetrical. Right? Do you know what information is gathered and to whom it gets taken? If you know that, then your ability to price the trade sensibly. What I'm getting, I'm happy with the price I'm paying. Right? It's over a decade since I first heard the phrase, if you're not the customer, you're the product. Okay? So we are used to the near, when it's free, it must be 100 years since people start saying there's no such thing as a free lunch, if not 1,000, if not 10,000. So I go back to the issue of any nexus of that sort, to saying if you can make it possible for people to come in and out, so that the on-ramps and off-ramps must be free, if you can take your information with you, and it's possible to have that validated, and if you know who else can see that and under what terms, so that there's symmetry of its purpose of use, then these things stabilize. The transition, when there is a lack of clarity about symmetry, and when there's a lack of clarity about freedom of movement, creates things that may worry many of us, but we are in the early stages of that, and the more we ask those questions, the more we surface them, the more likely it is that the emergent business models will be on the right side of it. You're right to concern yourself on it, but I'm an optimist.
Fantastic. Great. So we had another few more questions. Well, can you put your hands up, please, because I can't remember. So I'll try and go sort of roughly this way. I'll talk to you first, sir. Hold the microphone and speak clearly.
What do you feel is most likely to go wrong with the adoption of your abundance model in a wider scale?
The most likely thing I find I would worry about, I used a phrase earlier about it took IBM 40 years to become evil, Microsoft 20, Google 10, Facebook 5, Twitter 2.5. Right? Our tolerance for the behavior of large institutions is low. The exchanges and the infrastructures, the enablers I talk about, will run the risk of becoming monopolies in their own right. And they can only be balanced when you have the level of oligopoly or competitive market that we choose, okay? If we choose those markets on regional lines, we are killing the need for us to become global citizens. So we have to make sure that those lines don't become protectionist regimes of existing political structures, because then we've thrown it all away. If we can recreate those so that there is more than one, so there's choice for us in every one of these nexuses, every one of these platforms, and that when multiple platforms form, they do not form on existing political lines, then I think value has been created.
Do we have any more questions? I'm trying to go this way, so we've done, oh, hang on. Oh, no, here you are.
No, mine is really quick. Few. I want to know, how do you combine this wish for a true knowledge-based society based on abundance with the scarcity of natural resources, which is quite pressing, access to water, access to, basic public goods, which is a global issue. And how, I think it's going to be a good tension to resolve this aim, which I totally share with that
I don't think it's a tension. I actually think that in one lies the answer to the other, okay? I have very little faith that the institutions that were post the Second World War, that were built to help solve the problems, are able to solve the problems. So whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's climate change, whether it's disease control, I see many of the global institutions fundamentally failing. And they are failing because of the reasons that I gave in the previous answer. There tends to be only one, and where there is fragmentation, the fragmentation is on existing political lines. So my wish is that, like the emergent institutions that are enabling infrastructures, that are open platforms, are those that orchestrate themselves around different boundaries, and therefore make it easier for us to have dialogues that can work on those problems. Because there is a patent evidence to me that the current institutions are incapable of solving those using current tools.
I really liked your sentence. There is no such thing as info overload but filter failure.
Sorry?
There is no such thing as info overload but filter failure.
That's not mine, that is Clay Shirky's. Yeah. Yeah.
But I sense it's a little bit of a red thread in general in today's event, because with removing asymmetry and kind of inefficiency, with creating this abundance and openness of information, there is more focus on us, meaning us as individuals, us as a company, as an organization. So there is more introspection, sort of reflection, self-development. If we look at the examples of disruptive cases when companies disappeared completely, the disruption came from outside the industry even. So if you're a company and still doing this introspection and trying to understand what's happening with you, what tip would you give to companies today, corporations, to still not miss on what's happening from outside the industry?
Okay, I need to be brief. The next speaker is here, I can see him. I think that I have yet to find a company where the customer works for the company. Customers are people who pay companies money for goods or services received, and those customers tend to be outside the boundary of the company. If you want to change yourself as an organization, and you need to be outside the frame of reference that you traditionally are, and the customer is the place to start, but that customer, connected and able to express himself or herself, has changed dramatically. If you start with the customer, all other changes will follow. Thank you for your time.